My name is Mason Walker, 36 years old, and I learned everything I know about real estate from my father. When Dad passed last month, my stepmother Diane sent me a cold text. We're reading tomorrow, 2 p.m. Family only. After 20 years of her trying to push me out of Dad's life, this was her final move. What she didn't know was that Dad and I had our own arrangement. I stared at the property deeds on my desk and smiled. If you're watching this, drop a comment letting me know where you're from, hit that like button, and subscribe to see how I turn their inheritance into thin air. I was only 10 when my mother died from breast cancer. Dad, Richard Walker, became my entire world. He was already making a name for himself in real estate development, transforming neglected properties into thriving communities across 3 counties. Weekends weren't for baseball games or fishing trips, they were for property tours and renovation planning. By 12, I could estimate renovation costs within 10% accuracy. By 14, I was drafting preliminary property assessments. Dad didn't just teach me the business, he showed me how to build something meaningful. Everything changed when Diane entered our lives. Dad met her at a charity fundraiser when I was 16. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in him. I wanted to be happy for Dad. God knows he deserved some happiness after 6 years of raising me alone. But something felt off about Diane from the beginning. The way her smile never quite reached her eyes when Dad wasn't looking. How quickly she moved herself and her 2 children into our home. Trevor and Melissa, my step-siblings. We're 34 and 32 now, but back then they were teenagers who had never heard the word no. Trevor broke my mother's crystal vase during their first week in our house. When I confronted him, Diane somehow twisted the story, making it seem like I was being territorial and unwelcoming. Dad, eager to make the new family work, chose peace over confrontation. It became a pattern. "Mason, they're adjusting," Dad would say. "Let's give them time." But time only revealed their true colors more clearly. Trevor crashed 3 cars in 2 years. Dad replaced each one. Melissa failed out of her first college, then her second. Dad paid for private tutors and made donations to get her into a third. Meanwhile, I worked summers at Dad's office, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up. "You have a gift for this, Mason," Dad told me after I identified a promising commercial property others had overlooked. "You see value where others don't." Those moments with Dad became increasingly rare as Diane orchestrated a gradual separation between us. Family dinners became date nights with Diane. Weekend property visits became too much shop talk, according to my stepmother. When I moved out for college, Diane redecorated my room within a week. I studied real estate and urban development, graduated with honors, and started working for Dad's company. Even there, Diane's influence spread like a slow-moving poison. She convinced Dad to hire Trevor as operations manager despite his complete lack of qualifications. Melissa became the company's public relations consultant, a job that seemed to primarily involve long lunches and spa days on the company account. Dad's health began declining 2 years ago. Nothing specific at first, just less energy, more fatigue. Then came the diagnosis: heart failure. The doctors gave him medication, told him to reduce stress. Diane used this as justification to further limit my access to him. "Your father needs rest, Mason," she'd say, blocking the doorway to his study. "Business discussions are too taxing right now." But Dad found ways for us to connect. He'd call me directly when Diane was at her yoga class. Sometimes he'd have his driver bring him to my office unannounced. During one of these secret meetings 6 months before he died, Dad seemed unusually serious. "Mason, there's something important we need to discuss," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I've been watching how things have been going at home, at the office." He paused, looking tired but resolute. "I've been blind in some ways, son. Wanting to believe the best in people. But I'm seeing clearly now. That day, Dad showed me financial reports indicating unusual withdrawals from company accounts, all authorized by Trevor. Client complaints that had been hidden from Dad. Property assessments that had been altered. The picture was clear. My stepfamily wasn't just incompetent. They were actively damaging the company Dad had built over 30 years. They think I don't notice, Dad said, his hands trembling slightly. Diane believes I'm too weak or too distracted to see what's happening. But I've seen everything. There were other incidents that had opened Dad's eyes. The time Melissa had screamed at Dad's longtime assistant until the woman quit. The vacation properties that somehow became registered under Diane's maiden name. The friends, who mysteriously gained favorable deals through the company. The most painful revelation came during Dad's first hospitalization. I rushed to the hospital, only to be told by Diane that Dad was too tired for visitors. I later learned from a sympathetic nurse that Dad had been asking for me for hours. When I finally pushed past Diane's objections, Dad gripped my hand with surprising strength. "They're keeping you from me," he whispered. "Don't let them win, son." Our last meaningful conversation happened just a month before he died. Dad had his driver bring him to my house without telling Diane. He looked gaunt, but his eyes burned with purpose. "I've made arrangements," he said cryptically. "You'll understand when the time comes. Just remember everything I taught you about foundations." I thought he was speaking metaphorically about business principles. Only later would I understand he meant literal property foundations, and the documents that secured them. The last year of Dad's life was a careful chess game that I didn't know we were playing. While Diane thought she was isolating Dad from me, he was quietly putting pieces into position. I only understood the full strategy after he was gone. It started with what seemed like nostalgia. Dad insisted on visiting his first development property, a small apartment complex he'd renovated 30 years ago. "Remember how we used to check the foundation integrity first?" Dad asked as we walked the perimeter. "Always start with the foundation." I recited his long-taught principle. "Everything else is just decoration." Dad nodded, satisfied. "I'm going to need your signature on some paperwork. Just routine updates to the property registrations." I signed without much thought. Dad had always handled the legal aspects of our business. This happened several more times over the following months. Different properties, similar paperwork. Sometimes we'd visit the sites, other times Dad would bring the documents to our lunch meetings. Looking back, I should have paid more attention, but Dad's health was my primary concern. During one hospital stay, Dad asked me to bring his briefcase from home. Diane protested, but Dad insisted it contained medication information. When I delivered it, Dad locked the door to his hospital room. "I need you to sign these quickly," he said, pulling out transfer documents for 3 commercial buildings that formed the core of our most profitable district. "Don't ask questions now. You'll understand later." I trusted Dad completely and signed the papers. A notary, Dad's longtime friend, appeared minutes later to witness and formalize the documents. The entire exchange took less than 15 minutes. "Keep this between us," Dad said. "For now." As Dad's condition worsened, Diane's control tightened. She hired private nurses who reported only to her. She screened Dad's phone calls and visitors. Trevor took over more company operations, making disastrous decisions that I struggled to mitigate without undermining Dad's apparent wishes. The last time I saw Dad conscious was a week before he died. I had to pretend to be delivering documents from the office to get past Diane's gatekeeping. Dad was propped up in bed, oxygen tubes in his nose, but his eyes brightened when he saw me. "The safe in my study," he whispered. "Code is your mother's birthday. Everything you need is there." Dad squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "You were always the only one who understood what really matters. The only true heir to what I built." Before I could ask what he meant, Diane returned and practically pushed me out of the room. That was the last real conversation we had. The call came at 3 a.m. a week later. Dad had passed peacefully in his sleep, according to Diane. I rushed to the house but found the security code changed. I had to wait on the doorstep until Trevor opened the door, smirking. "Mom's resting," he said. "Funeral's on Thursday. Closed casket." I didn't even get to say a proper goodbye. The funeral was a performance directed by Diane, all about her grief, her loss. My father's business associates looked confused when I was seated in the third row, not with the immediate family. Several tried to offer condolences afterward, but Diane quickly intercepted them, steering conversations toward her difficult adjustment and responsibility to continue Richard's legacy. The text about the will reading came 3 days after the funeral. Will reading tomorrow. 2 p.m. Family only. Family only. After 20 years of Diane's manipulation, this was her final move to cut me out completely. But Dad's mysterious instructions about the safe nagged at me. That night, I used my old key to enter the house while everyone was at a grief support dinner Diane had organized at an expensive restaurant. Dad's study looked different. Diane had already begun redecorating, but the painting concealing the wall safe remained. My mother's birthday opened it just as Dad had said. Inside was a USB drive, a letter addressed to me, and a folder labeled "Transfers Complete." The folder contained copies of all the documents I'd signed over the past year: property transfers, deed registrations, company ownership stakes. Each one legally and permanently transferred ownership from Dad to me. The USB drive contained financial records, emails, and video recordings of conversations. Evidence of years of financial manipulation by Diane, Trevor, and Melissa. But it was Dad's letter that brought me to my knees. "Mason, if you're reading this, I've run out of time. I'm sorry for the deception, but it was necessary. Years ago, I made a terrible mistake trusting Diane. By the time I realized who she truly was, she had positioned herself to take everything I built, everything that should be yours. The documents you signed weren't routine updates. They were carefully planned transfers of my most valuable holdings directly to you. The properties, the core business assets, they're yours now, legally and irrevocably. I've had my most trusted lawyers verify that these transfers cannot be contested. What remains in my will is relatively minor, enough to keep Diane and her children fighting over scraps while you secure what truly matters." They never understood that real estate isn't about possessions, it's about foundation, legacy, and vision. You were always my true heir, not because you're my blood, but because you share my values. Don't let bitterness consume you. Build something meaningful with what I've left you. All my love. Dad. I sat in his study until dawn, processing everything. The depths of Diane's deception. The brilliance of Dad's counter-strategy. The weight of responsibility now on my shoulders. And underneath it all, grief for the father I'd lost and pride in his final act of protection. The will reading was in 12 hours. They weren't expecting me to attend. They had no idea what was coming. The morning after discovering Dad's safe, I called Jackson Wright, my personal attorney. We'd been friends since college, and I trusted him completely. I didn't trust myself to think clearly through the rage and grief clouding my judgment. "I need you to verify these transfers," I told him, spreading the documents across his office table. "I need to know if they're bulletproof." Jackson examined each document carefully, occasionally making calls to property offices and the county clerk. After 3 hours, he looked up with raised eyebrows. "Your father was thorough. These transfers were executed perfectly, filed properly, and timed strategically to avoid any appearance of undue influence or diminished capacity. He even had medical evaluations done the same day as major transfers to document his sound mind. So they're valid? Completely legal? I needed absolute certainty. More than valid. They're virtually attack-proof. Your father created an elegant legal fortress around these transfers. The timing, the independent witnesses. The separate transactions spaced months apart, it's brilliant legal strategy. I felt a surge of pride. Dad had always been 3 steps ahead in business negotiations. He'd applied that same strategic thinking to protect his legacy. What about this? I asked, showing him the USB drive contents. The evidence of financial misconduct was substantial: falsified expense reports, diverted client payments, manipulated property valuations. Jackson whistled. This is serious stuff, Mason. Some of this crosses into criminal territory. Should I go to the police? Let's hold that card for now. First, let's see how the will reading plays out. Speaking of which, are you planning to attend? Seems like your stepmother doesn't expect you. Oh, I'll be there, I said, gathering the documents. But I need to prepare. I spent the next several hours organizing everything. The property deeds were placed in a leather portfolio, arranged by acquisition date. I made copies of Dad's letter and the most damning evidence from the USB drive. I even prepared a simple spreadsheet showing the current market value of all the transferred properties, over $70 million worth of prime real estate. My phone buzzed repeatedly throughout the day. Diane, escalating from irritation to threats. The will reading is family only. Don't make a scene. Distant cousins I barely knew. Dad's golf buddy Frank, who had somehow earned an invitation. Diane's sister Patricia, who had visited exactly twice in 20 years but now sat in a position of prominence. This is a private meeting, Diane announced before I could take another step. For family only. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Martin looked uncomfortable but said nothing, caught between professional obligations and personal relationships. I am family, I said simply. Not according to Richard's final wishes, Diane countered, her voice dripping with false sympathy. This is difficult enough without complications. Trevor stood up, attempting intimidation with his height advantage. Mom asked you to leave. This is for heirs only. I remained perfectly still, holding my leather portfolio. Is that what this meeting is? For heirs only? Martin cleared his throat. Perhaps we should begin. Mrs. Walker has requested that only named beneficiaries be present for the reading. And has the will been read yet? Have the beneficiaries been named? I asked. Well, no, but then I'll wait until we determine if I'm included before leaving. I took an empty seat at the far end of the table. Unless someone wants to physically remove me? Trevor looked like he might accept that challenge, but Diane placed a restraining hand on his arm. Her strategy had always been about appearances. Martin, please call security, she said. We can't proceed with uninvited guests. Martin hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Diane, perhaps we could simply begin the reading. If Mason isn't named, he can leave then. This meeting is for heirs only, Diane repeated firmly. And we all know Richard's intentions. Do we? I asked quietly. The tension in the room was palpable. Melissa had finally looked up from her nails, sensing drama. The distant relatives shifted uncomfortably. Frank studied his shoes. Martin, ever the professional, attempted compromise. Let me at least begin the formalities. If it becomes clear that... No, Diane interrupted. I won't have Richard's final wishes disrespected. Mason knows he's not welcome. This is just another attempt to insert himself where he doesn't belong. 20 years of similar comments flashed through my mind. The family vacations I wasn't invited to. The holidays where my gifts were forgotten. The company events where I was introduced as an employee, rather than Dad's son. 1 minute, I said. Give me 1 minute to explain why I'm here. And if you still want me to leave, I will. Martin looked grateful for the potential resolution. That seems reasonable. Diane's mouth tightened, but she gave a curt nod. The room fell silent. My father and I spoke regularly during the last year of his life, I began. More often than anyone in this room realized. He was concerned about certain irregularities in both his personal and business affairs. Trevor shifted uncomfortably. Diane's expression remained frozen in practiced grief. He asked me to attend today because he knew there might be confusion about his true intentions. He wanted me to help clarify things if necessary. This is absurd, Diane hissed. Richard told me specifically that. Martin, I interrupted. Perhaps we could simply proceed with the reading? The documents will speak for themselves. Martin nodded, relieved to return to familiar professional territory. He adjusted his glasses and opened the formal will document. This is the last will and testament of Richard James Walker, being of sound mind and body. Martin began the standard legal preamble. I watched Diane's face as Martin read through the minor bequests. $10,000 to Dad's college roommate. His vintage car collection to Frank. Family heirlooms to various cousins. Personal items with sentimental rather than monetary value carefully distributed. Diane's impatience grew visibly with each small bequest. She wanted the main event, the properties, the business holdings, the millions in assets that formed Dad's true legacy. Trevor kept glancing at his watch. Melissa had resumed studying her nails. To my wife, Diane Catherine Walker, Martin continued, I leave our primary residence at 1420 Lakeview Drive, its contents, and the sum of $1 million. Diane's smug smile faltered slightly. Only $1 million? The house was worth $4 million alone, but she had clearly expected much more. To my stepson, Trevor Allen Cooper, I leave my ownership stake in Walker Development's Eastern Division, and the sum of $500,000. Trevor's face darkened. The Eastern Division was the smallest, least profitable segment of the business. To my stepdaughter, Melissa Jane Cooper, I leave my ownership stake in Walker Development's Management Division, and the sum of $500,000. Melissa actually looked up from her nails now, confusion replacing boredom. The Management Division existed primarily on paper. Martin paused, adjusting his glasses. Regarding the remainder of my estate, including but not limited to Walker Development's primary holdings, commercial properties at Riverfront Plaza, Westwood Business Park, the Downtown Development Project, Canterbury Hills Residential Community. He continued listing Dad's most valuable assets, the core of his real estate empire. Diane leaned forward, anticipation replacing her momentary concern. Status to be confirmed at time of reading, as these assets may have been subject to prior arrangements. Martin looked confused by his own reading. This wasn't standard will language. What does that mean? Diane demanded. Subject to prior arrangements? I'm not entirely sure, Martin admitted. This is unusual phrasing that was added in the most recent amendment. Well, find out what it means, Trevor snapped. Those properties are worth millions. The moment had arrived. I quietly opened my leather portfolio. I believe I can clarify, I said, my voice steady despite my pounding heart. All eyes turned to me as I placed the first property deed on the table. Riverfront Plaza was transferred to my ownership 6 months ago, I explained, sliding the document toward Martin. Completely legal, notarized, and filed with the county. Before anyone could respond, I placed the second deed on the table. Westwood Business Park was transferred 4 months ago. Then the third. Downtown Development, 3 months ago. And the fourth. Canterbury Hills, 2 months ago. With each document, Diane's face grew paler. Trevor's turned an alarming shade of red. Melissa's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. What is this? Diane finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. This meeting is for heirs only, I said, echoing her earlier words. These are the properties I already legally own. Dad transferred them to me while he was alive, of sound mind, with proper legal documentation. I placed the final document on the table, the spreadsheet showing the total value of the transferred properties. You mean the $70 million worth of real estate that I already own? I finished. Is that what you were expecting to inherit today? The silence that followed was absolute. Even breathing seemed too loud in the vacuum of shock that enveloped the room. Martin Harrison was the first to recover, professional instincts kicking in as he carefully examined each deed. "These appear to be in order," he said cautiously. "Properly executed, notarized, filed with the appropriate offices." Diane's shock transformed into calculated fury. "This is fraud," she hissed, though she made no move to touch the documents. "Richard would never do this. Mason clearly took advantage of his father's weakened state." Each transfer was accompanied by a medical certification of Dad's mental competence. I replied, sliding those documents forward as well. "Signed by 2 independent physicians on the day of transfer." Trevor lunged across the table, grabbing at the Westwood Business Park deed. "This is bullshit. Dad promised me Westwood." "Mr. Cooper." "Please," Martin cautioned, but Trevor was beyond reason. "You manipulated him when he was dying," Trevor shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You always were his little puppet." Following him around, pretending to care about his precious buildings. "Unlike you, who crashed company cars and embezzled development funds?" I asked quietly. Trevor froze. "What are you talking about?" I removed a flash drive from my pocket and placed it on the table. "Dad kept records. Very detailed records." Melissa, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly burst into tears. Not gentle, grieving tears, but angry, frustrated sobs. "This isn't fair. Mom said we'd never have to worry about money again after Richard died. You've ruined everything." "Melissa," Diane snapped, "but the damage was done." I turned to Martin. "The will mentions prior arrangements. I believe that refers to these transfers, which Dad executed legally while still alive. He left the other assets, the house, the cash bequests, the smaller divisions, in the will deliberately." Martin nodded slowly. "That would explain the unusual language. Richard was acknowledging that certain assets mentioned might no longer be part of his estate at time of death." "This is ridiculous," Diane said, struggling to regain control. "Richard and I discussed our future extensively. He wanted to secure my comfort, our children's inheritance. Would you like to see what Dad really thought?" I asked, removing the sealed letter from my portfolio. This was in his private safe, along with copies of all these deeds. I handed the letter to Martin rather than Diane. "Would you read it aloud, please?" As an impartial party. Martin accepted the letter, noting the seal was intact. He carefully opened it and scanned the contents, his eyebrows rising slightly. He cleared his throat and began to read. "To whom it may concern. If this letter is being read, it means the transfer of my primary assets to my son, Mason Walker, has been completed as planned and is now being questioned. Let me be absolutely clear, these transfers were done of my own free will, with full mental capacity, and after long consideration. For years I have watched Diane, Trevor, and Melissa demonstrate through their actions that they view my life's work merely as an ATM for their own desires. They have never understood nor respected what I built. Meanwhile, Mason has shown nothing but dedication, integrity, and vision, the values upon which I founded Walker Development. The transfer of these properties is not a deathbed decision, but a considered business strategy. I am placing my most valuable assets in the hands of the person most qualified and most committed to their proper stewardship. Diane, Trevor, and Melissa have been provided for appropriately in my will. The house, the cash bequests, and the smaller business divisions represent significant value. If they find these insufficient, perhaps they should reflect on the true nature of inheritance, not what you receive, but what you earn through your actions and character. Richard Walker. Martin finished reading and carefully folded the letter. The silence returned, heavier than before. "This is character assassination," Diane finally said, her voice trembling with rage rather than grief. "Richard would never write such things about me, about us. Mason obviously forged this letter. The letter is in Richard's handwriting. Martin noted quietly. I've seen enough of his signatures and notes over 30 years to recognize it. He was manipulated. Diane insisted. Coerced. I shook my head. Dad made these decisions over the course of a year, not in some last-minute change. He saw what was happening in his company, in his home. What exactly are you implying? Diane demanded. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. I turned to Martin. Dad also left evidence of financial irregularities. Funds diverted from company accounts to personal use. Client payments redirected. Company resources used for private expenses. Trevor lurched to his feet again. You lying piece of. Trevor modified property valuations to secure higher loans. Then pocketed the difference. I continued, addressing Martin rather than my enraged stepbrother. Melissa charged hundreds of thousands in personal expenses to company accounts while contributing nothing. And Diane systematically isolated Dad from his longtime friends, business associates, and from me, all while positioning herself to take control of everything he built. This is slander, Diane cried. We'll sue you for every penny. With what evidence? I asked. Dad kept records of everything. Would you like the courts examining those records in detail? The IRS? The Banking Commission? The threat of public exposure hit home. Diane had always cared deeply about her social standing. I'm not interested in legal battles or public scandals. I continued more softly. Dad provided for you in his will. The house, the money. The smaller business divisions, they're still yours. That was his choice, and I respect it. You expect us to just accept this? Trevor snarled. I expect you to respect Dad's legally executed wishes, I replied. Just as I am. Melissa had stopped crying, her expression calculating. We could contest the transfers. Claim undue influence. Martin cleared his throat again. As Mr. Walker's longtime attorney, I feel professionally obligated to advise that contesting these transfers would be extraordinarily difficult. Richard created an unassailable paper trail demonstrating his competence and intention. Multiple independent witnesses, medical certifications. Transactions spaced over time rather than one sudden change. Additionally, given the evidence Mr. Walker mentions, litigation would risk exposing matters best kept private. Diane's face showed she understood the full implications. A legal challenge would mean public scrutiny of everything, including their own actions. This isn't over, she said, standing abruptly. Richard wouldn't want his family torn apart over money. This isn't about money, I said, gathering my documents. It's about legacy. About honoring what Dad built and the values he stood for. Trevor made one last lunge across the table. But not for the documents this time, for me. His fist connected with my jaw before Frank and Martin could pull him back. You think you've won? He shouted as they restrained him. You've got some papers. We were his real family. We lived with him, took care of him, while you were playing businessman. I touched my lip, finding blood. Is that why you hid his calls to me? Why you changed the security code during his final days? Why you held a closed-casket funeral when Dad always said he wanted to be cremated and his ashes scattered at his first development site? Trevor struggled against Frank's grip. You know nothing about what he wanted. Actually, Martin interjected. The funeral arrangements in Richards will do specify cremation and ash scattering at the Parkview Apartments site. That request was overridden by Mrs. Walker. Diane gathered her purse, her composure cracking. We're leaving. This ambush is completely inappropriate during our time of grief. One last thing, I said as they moved toward the door. Dad's personal items in his study, photo albums, journals, his collection of property sketches. I'd like those, please. Absolutely not. Diane snapped. The house and its contents are mine. Check the will language, Martin suggested gently. Richard's personal effects in his study are specifically bequeathed to Mason. It was a final, small victory, but it mattered. Those items held no monetary value but contained decades of memories, Dad's handwritten notes, the tangible remnants of his thoughts and dreams. As Diane, Trevor, and Melissa stormed out, the remaining attendees sat in stunned silence. The distant relatives and Frank looked uncertain whether to stay or follow. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess," Martin suggested. "The remainder of the will contains only minor bequests." As the room cleared, Martin approached me privately. "Richard came to see me a year ago," he confided. "He was concerned about certain patterns he'd observed. He asked me to help design a strategy that would be legally unassailable." "Thank you for helping him," I said sincerely. Martin nodded. "He was very proud of you, Mason. Not just your business acumen, but your character. He told me, Mason understands that we don't own properties, we're just their temporary stewards. That's why he trusted you with his legacy." As everyone filed out, I remained seated, feeling the weight of that legacy on my shoulders. Dad had protected his life's work from those who would squander it. Now it was my responsibility to prove his faith in me was justified. The weeks following the will reading were strangely quiet. I had braced for an onslaught of legal challenges, public accusations, or at minimum, a barrage of angry messages. Instead, there was virtual silence from Diane and her children. Martin explained this was likely strategic. Their attorneys would have advised them that challenging the transfers would be both expensive and ultimately futile. "They're regrouping," he cautioned. "Diane won't accept defeat easily." He was right. 3 weeks after the will reading, I received notice that Diane was petitioning the court to invalidate the property transfers, claiming I had exerted undue influence over Richard during his diminished capacity. My own attorneys were unconcerned. "This will never get traction," Jackson assured me. "The documentation your father put together is absolutely bulletproof. Multiple witnesses, medical certifications, transactions spaced over time. The judge will likely dismiss this before it even gets to discovery." He was right. 6 weeks after filing, Diane's petition was rejected by the court. The judge's comments were particularly satisfying. The deceased demonstrated remarkable foresight in documenting his mental capacity and intentions. The court finds no evidence of undue influence, but rather a clear pattern of deliberate estate planning executed over time. Meanwhile, I had begun the process of reclaiming Dad's legacy at Walker Development. The company had suffered under Trevor's mismanagement. Several key employees had left. Client relationships had deteriorated. Projects were behind schedule and over budget. During my first company-wide meeting as majority owner, I was direct. "We're returning to the principles that made this company successful. Integrity, quality, community impact. Some of you worked with my father for decades and know what those principles look like in practice. Others will need to adapt or find opportunities elsewhere." Trevor and Melissa had already cleared out their offices, taking whatever wasn't bolted down in the process. Several of their allies in the company resigned before I could address their involvement in the financial irregularities. I chose not to pursue legal action against them, not out of mercy, but because Dad wouldn't have wanted his company's reputation tarnished by public scandal. 6 weeks after taking control, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Frank, Dad's longtime golf buddy, asked to speak privately. "There's something you should know," he said once we were alone. "Your dad talked to me about what he was planning. Asked my advice, actually." This surprised me. Frank had always seemed firmly in Diane's camp, especially in recent years. "I've known Richard since college," Frank continued. "Knew your mother too. Good woman. After she died, I watched Richard throw himself into raising you and building the business." He paused. "When Diane came along, I was actually relieved. Thought Richard might finally have some happiness again." "We all did," I admitted. "Thing is, I saw it changing him. The company started focusing more on flash than substance. Richard became isolated from his old friends. And the way they treated you. Frank shook his head. I should have said something sooner. Why didn't you? Frank looked ashamed. Diane made it very clear that anyone who didn't embrace the new family dynamic wouldn't be welcome. I chose access to my old friend over doing what was right. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small recorder. Last year, Richard asked me to record a conversation. Said it might be important someday. I think he wanted backup evidence in case things got ugly after he was gone. The recording was brief but devastating. Diane, Trevor, and Melissa discussing their plans for after Richard is gone. Diane mocking Dad's sentimental attachment to properties that should be liquidated for cash. Trevor boasting about deals he'd line up once he had control. Melissa complaining that they were stuck playing nice until they got their hands on the old man's money. Dad knew, I said quietly after listening. He knew exactly who they were. Frank nodded sadly. He figured it out gradually. Said he'd been a fool in love but wasn't going to be a fool in business. Started putting things in motion about a year before he died. Why are you giving me this now? Insurance, Frank said simply. Diane's been talking to mutual friends, spinning a story about how you manipulated Richard and stole their inheritance. Most people who really knew Richard aren't buying it, but still, thought you should have this in your back pocket. I thanked him sincerely. The recording wasn't necessary legally, Dad's transfers were secure, but it provided personal vindication. Dad had seen through the deception. He hadn't been manipulated by either side. He had made clear-eyed decisions based on 20 years of evidence. Another unexpected development came when I finally collected Dad's personal items from his study. Diane had delayed this as long as possible, finally relenting only when Martin threatened legal action to enforce the will's provisions. Among Dad's journals and photo albums was a small book I'd never seen before, a daily diary he'd kept during his last year. The entries were brief but revealing. Mason identified structural issues in the Westbrook project today that would have cost millions if caught later. Trevor was supposed to oversee inspections but was too busy. The contrast between my son and my stepson grows more painful each day. Diane asked about changing my will again. Claimed she's concerned about proper distribution of assets. Meanwhile, discovered she's registered the Palm Springs house under her maiden name. Beginning to see a pattern I've been blind to for too long. Meeting with Martin today to discuss transfers. Need to protect what I've built. Mason is the only one who truly understands the responsibility that comes with these properties. Not just assets, but communities, jobs, legacies. The final entry, dated just days before his death, hit me hardest. Everything is in place now. Mason will face challenges, but he's stronger than he knows. My greatest regret is the years lost to Diane's manipulation, the distance she created between my son and me. My greatest comfort is knowing Mason will preserve what matters. Not just buildings and businesses, but principles and purpose. That's the true inheritance. I closed the diary, eyes burning with unshed tears. Dad had known. He had seen everything clearly at the end, and had acted decisively to protect not just his assets, but his true legacy. 2 months after the will reading, I received an email from Melissa. Unlike Diane and Trevor, she had maintained complete silence until now. I know you think we're all terrible people. Maybe we are. But you should know that Trevor's gambling debts are worse than anyone realizes. He owes dangerous people serious money. That's why he was so desperate for his inheritance. I'm not asking for anything for myself, but if something happens to him, it's on you. The emotional manipulation was transparent, but the information about Trevor's gambling was new. I forwarded the email to Jackson, who had connections in law enforcement. Let's make sure Trevor's problems don't become your problems, Jackson advised. I'll have some discreet inquiries made about who he might owe and how serious the situation is. Those inquiries revealed that Trevor had indeed accumulated massive gambling debts. primarily to offshore online casinos operating in legal gray areas. He had already sold the eastern division of Walker Development that he'd inherited, at a fraction of its value, to cover some of these debts. I felt no satisfaction in this confirmation of Trevor's self-destruction. Despite everything, I couldn't help remembering the teenager who had moved into our house. Desperate for attention and validation. Dad had tried to provide positive guidance, but Diane had always undermined those efforts, excusing and enabling Trevor's worst impulses. Through my attorneys, I made Trevor an offer: professional gambling addiction treatment, financial counseling, and a structured trust that would provide moderate income without access to principal. The trust would also directly pay off his legitimate debts to prevent further harassment from creditors. "Why would you do this?" Jackson asked when I outlined my plan. "After everything they did?" I thought about Dad's final journal entry. About principles and purpose. "Because it's what Dad would have done," I answered simply. He believed in giving people chances to rebuild, to start over. It's why he specialized in redeveloping neglected properties. He saw potential where others saw only ruin. Trevor rejected my offer through his attorney, calling it insulting charity. 2 weeks later, he was arrested for attempting to sell counterfeit luxury watches to undercover police. The mugshot that appeared in local news showed a man I barely recognized, hollow-eyed, unshaven, desperate. Diane, meanwhile, had begun selling off furniture and artwork from the house, converting assets to cash as quickly as possible. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard she was planning to move to Florida once the house sold, presumably to take advantage of that state's strong protections against creditors. I found I had no anger left, only a profound sadness for the waste of it all. Dad had offered them every opportunity: financial security, meaningful work, family connection. They had chosen greed, deception, and manipulation instead. My focus turned fully to rebuilding Walker Development according to Dad's original vision. I rehired several key employees who had left during Trevor's tenure. I personally visited every active project site, reviewing plans and progress. I reached out to longtime clients who had been neglected or mistreated. Richard would be proud. Martin told me after I successfully rescued a community development project that Trevor had nearly derailed. "You're not just preserving his legacy, you're building on it." That was my goal, not simply to maintain what Dad had created, but to extend his vision into the future. To be a worthy steward of the foundation he had laid. 6 months after the will reading, Walker Development held a community event to mark the completion of our latest project: affordable housing for seniors on what had previously been an abandoned industrial site. It was the kind of project Dad had loved most, transforming neglected space into something that served genuine community needs while still being financially sustainable. As I prepared to cut the ribbon, I scanned the crowd of community members, city officials, and company employees. I spotted many familiar faces, people who had worked with Dad for decades, who shared his vision of development as community service rather than mere profit-seeking. I also saw some unexpected attendees. Frank was there, of course. But so were several distant relatives who had attended the will reading, looking somewhat uncomfortable but supportive. Even more surprising was the presence of Melissa, standing at the back, trying to be inconspicuous. After the ceremony, she approached hesitantly. "Nice project," she offered awkwardly. "Dad, I mean Richard, would have approved." It was the first time I'd heard any of them acknowledge Dad's actual values rather than their projection of him as merely a source of money. "Thanks," I said, genuinely surprised by her presence. "What brings you here?" Melissa looked down, uncharacteristically subdued. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. Mom's moving to Florida next month. Trevor's facing serious charges. It's all falling apart." I waited, unsure where this was heading. "The things Richard wrote in that letter," she continued, "about us never understanding what he built. About values and character. I've been thinking maybe he was right." She looked up finally. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to see what he was talking about. What actually mattered to him. It was the closest thing to self-awareness I'd ever heard from Melissa. I didn't entirely trust it. Years of manipulation had made me cautious. But I recognized the courage it took for her to come. Would you like a tour of the facility? I offered. I could show you the features Dad insisted on that weren't in the original plans. The community spaces, the gardens. She nodded, and for the next hour, I showed her what development looked like when guided by principles rather than pure profit. How thoughtful design could create not just buildings but communities. How Dad's insistence on quality materials meant projects that lasted decades rather than years. I never understood any of this, Melissa admitted as we completed the tour. When Mom talked about the business, it was always about how much money it made, how it paid for our lifestyle. I never thought about the actual buildings, the people who lived or worked in them. Dad always said we're just temporary stewards. I told her. These buildings will outlast us. The communities they create will continue long after we're gone. That's the real legacy. She nodded thoughtfully. I'm moving to Seattle next month. Starting over. Got a job as an administrative assistant at a nonprofit. It doesn't pay much, but... She shrugged. Maybe it's time I earned something for a change. I wished her well, genuinely. Whether her transformation was lasting or temporary, at least she was trying. That was more than could be said for Diane or Trevor. In the year that followed, Walker development flourished. We completed 3 major projects that had stalled under Trevor's mismanagement. We launched 2 new initiatives focused on sustainable urban renewal. We established a foundation in Dad's name to provide scholarships for students pursuing careers in community-focused architecture and development. I occasionally heard updates about my former stepfamily. Diane had indeed moved to Florida, where she was reportedly trying to integrate into wealthy social circles with limited success. Trevor had eventually accepted a modified version of my offer after his legal troubles escalated, and was now in a structured rehabilitation program. Melissa had maintained her job in Seattle and had recently enrolled in community college classes. Their paths were their own now, separate from mine and from Dad's legacy. I wished them no ill will, but felt no obligation to maintain connections that had never been genuine. What surprised me most in that year of rebuilding was the reemergence of Dad's old friends and colleagues. People who had been gradually pushed out of his life by Diane but who carried valuable memories and insights about who he had truly been. Through their stories, I discovered dimensions of Dad I had never fully appreciated. His quiet financial support of employees facing medical crises. His mentorship of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. His principled stance against development that would have been profitable but harmful to existing communities. One elderly architect who had worked with Dad in his early days told me, "Richard always said buildings are really about people, not property. That's what made him different from other developers." He never forgot that what he was really building was human habitat. That insight guided my decisions as I moved forward with Dad's company, our company now. Each project began with the question, how will this serve the people who live or work here? How will this contribute to community rather than just to our bottom line? Dad had protected his physical assets through careful legal planning. But his true legacy was the vision and values he had instilled in me. The understanding that wealth brings responsibility. That development should enhance communities, not exploit them. That success is measured not just in dollars but in positive impact. As I stood on the rooftop garden of our newest completed project, watching residents enjoy the space we had created, I felt Dad's presence more strongly than I had since his death. Not as a ghost or supernatural force, but as a continuation of purpose. His vision living on through decisions made and priorities honored. The property deeds Dad had transferred to me were just paper. The buildings themselves were just structures of concrete, steel, and glass. The true inheritance was the understanding that we build not merely for profit but for purpose. That we develop not just properties but possibilities. That what matters most is not what we acquire but what we create. That was Dad's final lesson, one I would spend a lifetime honoring and extending into the future he could no longer shape directly but had prepared me to steward faithfully. If you've stayed with me through this story, I'd love to know, what inheritance, tangible or intangible, has shaped your life? Has someone ever underestimated what you were capable of, only to be surprised when you revealed your true strength? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that like button if this resonated with you, subscribe to hear more stories of justice and vindication. Thank you for listening, and remember that sometimes the most valuable legacies aren't the ones written in wills, but the ones written in our character and actions.